I need you to understand something before I start. I am 21 years old, and I have already lived through more than most people see in a lifetime. I've been manipulated by someone I loved. I've been left for dead emotionally while I was fighting for my actual life in a hospital bed. I've swallowed pills with a plan that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. And I've watched the person I once threw away become the one person who refused to let me disappear. I've never told this story out loud, not the full version. Not the parts that make me look stupid or naive or like someone who walked straight into a trap with her eyes half open because she wanted so badly to believe she'd finally found something real. But I'm tired of carrying it quietly. So here it is. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I grew up in a house where the floors were marble and the silences were long, and my father was the kind of man other men called before they made important decisions. We weren't the kind of wealthy that people can smell on you immediately. My father was deliberate about that, careful with how we moved through the world, but the money was there. The connections were there. And from the time I was about 12 years old, I understood, in the vague, unspoken way that children understand things, that my future was already partially constructed. His name was Daniel. He was the son of my father's closest business partner, a man named Mr. Hargrove who had been in my father's orbit for over a decade. Daniel and I grew up at the same dinner tables, the same holiday parties, the same summer trips that our families took when they wanted to call it leisure but were really just extending the work week. We were friends, genuinely. The kind of friends who don't have to talk to feel comfortable, who send each other stupid memes at 2 in the morning, who can be in the same room reading different books and feel completely at ease. He was quiet in a way that felt intentional, like he'd made a choice early on to watch more than he spoke. He had this habit of tilting his head slightly when he was actually listening to you, not performing listening, but actually taking in what you were saying, and I noticed it even as a kid. He was kind in ways that didn't ask for credit. He would remember things you'd mentioned once and bring them up weeks later with no fanfare, just a quiet acknowledgement that he'd heard you. I knew he loved me. I knew it the way you know a fact you've never had to verify. It was just there, steady and unspoken like weather, and I didn't feel it back, not in that way. I loved him the way I loved my oldest memories, warmly, safely, without electricity. So when Daniel sat across from me one afternoon when I was 19 in the garden of my parents' house and said, quietly and without performance, "I'd like to marry you. If you'd let me," I felt the bottom of my stomach drop. Not with joy, with dread, because I already knew what I was going to say and I already knew how much it was going to cost him. "Daniel," I stopped, I looked at my hands. "I love you, I do, but I can't. I'm not in love with you, and you deserve someone who is." He didn't argue, he didn't get angry. He just nodded very slowly, like he'd already run through this possibility and had prepared for it. His jaw tightened for just a second and then it released and he said, "Okay." One word, just okay. I didn't understand then why that single word made me feel so much worse than anger would have. Both families found out quickly, because families like ours don't really have private conversations. They have conversations that ripple outward. My mother looked at me like I'd dropped something irreplaceable. My father asked me to come to his study that evening, and when I sat down across from his desk, he looked older than he had that morning. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He was quiet for a long time. "Can I ask you something?" "Is there someone else?" I didn't answer fast enough. "There's someone else," he said, not a question. And that was when I told him about John. I need to explain John the way I understood him then, not the way I understand him now, because those are two completely different people. John, as I knew him at 19, was an assistant professor at my university. He taught a contemporary literature seminar that I'd signed up for on a whim because the class time worked, and the catalog description had one sentence that caught me. He was 28. He had this easy, unhurried way of speaking that made even ordinary sentences feel considered. He wore the same rotation of simple clothes, dark jeans, clean shirts, one good jacket, and there was something deliberately unshowy about it that I found immediately interesting. He was the kind of person who looked at you when you spoke, not just at your face, but at you, like he was actually reading what was happening underneath the words. I said something in that first seminar, something about the way a particular author used landscape as emotional displacement, and John paused the class discussion for a moment and said, "That's a really precise observation. Can you say more about what you mean by that?" I talked for about 2 minutes. He listened the whole time. The other students took notes. I was 20 years old and I felt, for the first time in my life, like someone was actually paying attention to me. Not to my family name, not to the daughter of, just to me. I know how that reads now, I know. But I need you to understand that at the time it felt like oxygen after a room with not enough air. We didn't start anything immediately. It was gradual coffees after class that turned into longer conversations, walks across campus that turned into dinners off campus, and intellectual intimacy that turned slowly into something else. He told me about his childhood, a difficult one, he said, father not around much, mother who worked hard and worried more, and it made him feel real to me in a way that people in my world often didn't. He had edges. He had history. He wasn't performing comfort the way so many men in my life had been trained to do. He made me feel like choosing him was an act of independence. I should have listened more carefully to that feeling. Because independence that someone else is curating for you isn't independence at all. When I told my father about John, he went very still. "How long has this been going on?" he said. "A few months, and you've been spending time with him off campus?" "Yes." He stood up and walked to the window. His back was to me when he spoke again. "I want you to stop seeing him. Dad, I'm not asking you to explain your feelings to me. I'm asking you to stop seeing him. You don't even know him." He turned around, and his expression was something I'd never seen on him before, not anger exactly, something closer to fear. "I know enough," he said. "Trust me on this one, please." I thought he was being controlling. I thought he was trying to redirect me back toward Daniel, toward the marriage that served his business interests, toward the future he'd already drafted for me. I thought the fear on his face was the fear of losing leverage. I was so wrong, but I didn't know that yet, so I left. I packed a bag while my mother stood in the doorway of my room and didn't say anything, which was somehow worse than anything she could have said. I told her I'd call. I didn't tell her where I was going. I moved into John's apartment. 2 weeks later, we drove to a courthouse on a Tuesday morning. No guests, no ceremony, just 2 signatures and a date stamped in ink. I called my father from the parking lot afterward. He didn't answer. I told myself that was fine. I told myself I'd made my choice. The first months were good. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier to say they weren't. It would clean up the story, make me look less foolish, but they were good. The apartment was small and the furniture was mismatched, and we ordered takeout more nights than not, and I was genuinely happy in the way that feels light-footed and simple. We talked late into the night. We argued about books. We took long walks on weekend mornings and found coffee shops and sat across from each other reading, and I would look up sometimes and think, this is real, this is my life, I chose this. But there were things I noticed, small things that I filed away without looking at too closely. John had a phone he sometimes answered in the other room. He had meetings he described vaguely and rescheduled often. He knew people whose names he never volunteered context for, men who called him, men he met for drinks that he mentioned afterward in passing. He had, when I look back, a fluency with wealthy people that was slightly odd for a junior academic on an assistant professor's salary. He knew which restaurants to go to. He knew how to speak to certain people in certain ways. He knew things he shouldn't have known about my family's financial arrangements that I'd never told him. I noticed these things and I set them aside because setting them aside was easier than asking questions I was afraid to hear answered. Then I started getting sick. It began as exhaustion. The kind that sleep doesn't fix, that sits in your bones when you wake up in the morning like your body is already tired of the day. I thought it was stress. I thought it was the adjustment of the new life, the estrangement from my family, the quiet grief of that I hadn't fully let myself feel. Then the pain started, a deep, persistent ache in my chest that came and went without explanation. I lost weight without trying. I would stand up too fast and the room would tilt. I went to a clinic because I didn't want to worry John. The doctor at the clinic referred me to a specialist. The specialist ordered tests. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a beige office across from a woman who was very careful with her words, and she told me what the tests had found. Lymphoma, stage 2, but moving. I don't know how to describe the next several minutes. It was like the volume in the room dropped to 0. I could see her mouth moving. I could see the pamphlets she was placing on the desk between us. I could feel my hands in my lap, but I couldn't feel anything in my hands. I thought absurdly of my mother. I thought of the particular way she squeezed my shoulder when something was hard. I thought of the garden at my parents' house, and Daniel sitting across from me saying okay with his jaw tight, and I thought for one wild and terrifying second, what if I made every wrong choice? I called John from the parking lot. He came, of course he came. He sat with me in the car while I told him, and he held my hand and said all the right things. He said we would get through this. He said he wasn't going anywhere. He said we would figure out treatment and it would be okay, and he was right here. But there was a moment, just a moment, not even a full second, when I looked at his face right after I said the word cancer, before he'd arranged his expression into concern. I saw something else. I've tried 1,000 times to name it precisely. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fear of losing me. It was the expression of someone who had just received information that changed their calculations. It was almost like surprise, yes, but the kind of surprise that's immediately being processed into strategy. It vanished so fast that I told myself I'd imagined it. I hadn't imagined it. But that knowledge would take months to become something I could hold. Chemotherapy is its own kind of time. It doesn't move the way regular time moves. It stretches and compresses in ways that have nothing to do with clocks. Some hours felt like they lasted days. Some entire weeks felt like a smear, a blur of nausea and exhaustion, and the particular fluorescent light of treatment rooms that I will never be able to see again without my body remembering. My hair went first. I knew it was coming and it still undid me, standing in the bathroom one morning and watching it come away in my hands in a way I can't describe to you except to say that it felt like my body was surrendering something before I'd agreed to. John was there less. It started with reasons, work obligations, meetings, the logistics of keeping a life running while one person in it was ill, all understandable, all reasonable individually. But I would lie in the hospital bed during infusion and watch the door and count the hours since I'd heard from him, and the counts kept getting longer. When he visited, he was present but absent. He would sit with me, but his phone was always in his hand. He would ask how I was feeling with his eyes somewhere else. He touched me less. He looked at me differently, or maybe more accurately, he looked through me like I had become inconvenient rather than beloved. I told myself he was scared. I told myself that some people contract in the face of illness, that fear makes them pull back rather than lean in, that this was his limitation and not a verdict on his love. I had nowhere else to go. My family didn't know where I was. I had no money that wasn't rooted through John. I had nothing really except the story I was telling myself about what I meant to him, so I kept telling it. And then the door opened and Daniel walked in. I don't know how long he stood in the doorway before I noticed him. I was having a bad day, the kind where just existing takes all your focus, and I was looking at the ceiling doing the breathing thing my nurse had taught me. When I finally turned my head and saw him, I thought I was having some kind of episode. Some fever dream version of the person my guilt had been generating. But he walked toward me, and he pulled a chair close to the bed, and he sat down, and he looked at me with an expression that I cannot fully describe except to say that it had no pretense in it at all. He looked exhausted, dark circles that suggested weeks of bad sleep. He'd lost some weight. His hands, when he set them on his knees, were not quite steady. "How did you find me?" I said. "Your father," he said. "We've been trying for months. Your husband is very good at making people unfindable." I didn't say anything. "I need to show you something," he said, "and I need you to look at it even if it's hard. Especially if it's hard." He took out his phone. He held it out to me. I looked. The first photo was John on a street I didn't recognize, holding hands with a woman, my close friend Alyssa. The timestamp was from 3 weeks after I'd been admitted for my first round of treatment. I scrolled. More photos, different women, one I recognized from John's department, one I didn't know at all. Texts, screenshots of conversations with a tenderness in them that I recognized, because it was the same tenderness he'd used with me. The same words almost, the same cadences. He had a script. He had been running it on multiple people simultaneously, and I had been one of many, and I had given up everything for it. My hands were shaking, the phone was shaking. "There's more," Daniel said. He said it gently but without softening it, the way you speak to someone when you've decided they deserve the truth even if the truth is terrible. He told me about John. The real John. John was not an assistant professor. He had never completed his doctorate. The position at the university had been arranged through his father, who was the chairman of the university's board, a fact that had been kept carefully quiet, that had allowed John to occupy a role that gave him access to students and the appearance of legitimacy he needed for what he actually did. What he actually did was this: he identified women from wealthy families. He researched them, learned their insecurities, learned what they were hungry for that they weren't getting at home. He built relationships with them, real feeling, particular, intimate relationships, and then he used those relationships for money, for access, for leverage. There was a network behind it, men who wanted connections to certain families, certain businesses, certain fortunes, and John was how they got those connections. "He targeted you specifically," Daniel said, "because of your father's company." The room was very quiet. "Daniel," my voice came out strange. "How do you know all of this?" He looked at the floor, a long pause. When he looked back up, there was something in his face that I had never seen there before, a kind of shame so acute it looked like it was causing him physical pain. "Because I used to be part of it," he said. I have thought about that moment 10,000 times. The moment he said those words and I lay there in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm, unable to run, unable to leave, having to just receive it. He didn't rush to explain himself. He gave me the space to react, and my reaction was a silence that lasted a long time. "How part of it?" I finally said. "Years ago," he said, "before I fully understood what it was. I was young and my father was involved, and I thought it was just business, networking, favors between connected people." He stopped, started again. "And then I was there for something I can't describe to you right now, something that made it undeniable what it actually was, what it was actually doing to people. And I walked away." "Your father," I said. He nodded. "He's the one running it." Daniel nodded again. His hands were clasped together now, so tight the knuckles had gone pale. And then the full architecture of it assembled itself in my mind, all the pieces that had never quite fit snapping together at once, and I understood. Mr. Hargrove hadn't wanted me to marry Daniel because he loved me like a daughter. He'd wanted me to marry Daniel because my father's company was worth a great deal of money, and Daniel's marriage to me would have created a legal and financial entanglement that served the network's purposes. When I'd rejected Daniel, that plan had failed. So they'd sent John as a backup, and my father had known. He had found out from Daniel, who had gone to him, who had betrayed his own father to warn mine, and that was why my father had begged me not to see John, had looked at me with fear instead of anger, because he knew exactly what John was and what John would do, and he hadn't been able to explain it in time. And I had walked out the door anyway. He's known where I am this whole time, I said. My father? No, John moved you deliberately, changed everything when he found out your father was looking. Your father has been. Daniel stopped. He rubbed his face. He's been very scared, we both have. I looked at the ceiling. My eyes were full and I was not going to cry, and then I was crying and I couldn't stop. Daniel didn't say anything. He pulled his chair closer and he sat there, and after a minute his hand covered mine on the blanket and I didn't pull away. There is a part of this story I've never told anyone. Not my father, not my doctors, not the therapist I started seeing after. 3 weeks after Daniel found me, there was a night when the treatment had been particularly brutal and I was alone in my room and John hadn't come in 6 days, and I thought, with a clarity that scared me, that the calculation had become simple. I was too sick to get better. The person I'd given my life to was counting down to my death for a payout. My family had spent months searching for me, and I had made that necessary through my own blindness. I was 20 years old and bald and in pain, and I had nothing left that felt like mine. I had gotten a hold of something I shouldn't have gotten a hold of. I was very far down that road when the door opened. Daniel had come back. He'd left something, a jacket, I think, something small and ordinary, and he'd come back for it. And instead of a jacket, he found me, and he took one look at what he was seeing, and he crossed the room in about 2 steps, and he took the thing out of my hands, and he said, "No, just that." Not a speech, not a lecture, just no. And then he sat on the floor next to my bed, right there on the hospital floor, and he pulled his knees up and he just stayed. All night, when I fell asleep, he was there. When I woke up at 3 in the morning, he was still there, awake, looking at nothing. In the morning, he went and found my doctor and arranged for a mental health consultation and did not leave the hospital until he had confirmed it was happening. And then he came back. He came back every day after that. He was there for the chemo sessions where I vomited so hard it felt like my whole body was trying to turn itself inside out. He was there for the nights when I couldn't sleep and just needed someone to talk, even if the talking was incoherent. He was there when the doctor said the treatment was working, and the way his face changed in that moment, the relief, the brightness of it, was more convincing than anything John had ever said to me. When I cried about my hair, he didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell me it was fine or it would grow back or I was being silly. He held my face in his hands and looked at me and said, "You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever known," and it didn't sound like a line because his voice cracked a little when he said it. I started to understand something then in those hospital months that I hadn't understood before. There is a kind of love that performs itself for an audience, that needs witnesses and grand gestures and the theatrical quality of big romantic moments. And there is another kind that just shows up. That shows up on a Tuesday at 11 at night when there is nothing romantic about the situation, when the person you love is sick and scared and not easy to be around, and you show up anyway because there is nowhere else you want to be. Daniel had always been the second kind. I had been so focused on the missing electricity that I'd never learned to recognize the warmth. He asked me one evening, sitting in the chair beside my bed, quiet for a long time after I'd told him what it had felt like to be in that apartment with John, what it had felt like to slowly understand that I was being watched rather than loved. He didn't respond to any of it immediately. He sat with it, and then he said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. "For what?" "I should have been clearer. When you said no, I should have told you what I knew, about John, about my father. I was afraid of what it would do to your family if the truth came out, and I was afraid of what you'd think of me, and I let those things stop me from protecting you. And that was wrong. You were protecting your father. I was protecting myself," he said, "and that's not the same thing." I thought about that for a long time. "Daniel," I said finally, "will you say the thing you're not saying?" He looked at me. "I don't know if this is the right time. I'm in a hospital bed on my best day. There may not be a better time." He almost smiled. Then he took a breath and said, "I would like a chance to be the person who shows up for you. Not because of our families, not because of any of that, because I have loved you for a very long time, and I think I always knew I'd be waiting here. I just didn't expect it to look like this." I felt my throat close. "I might not survive this," I said. I meant it. The statistics weren't great. There were no guarantees. He nodded. He already knew. "I still choose you," he said, and I understood then that I was not choosing safely. I was not choosing the easy or the practical or the arranged. I was choosing, with everything clarified and everything ugly already visible, the person who had been sitting on a hospital floor at 3 in the morning for no reason other than that he wanted to be there. We got married in the hospital chapel 8 days later. My parents cried. My mother held my face the way she did when I was small, and everything was fixable by her being close. My father shook Daniel's hand and then pulled him into a hug and kept his hand on his shoulder for a long time, and I understood, watching them, how long they had been in this thing together. I was bald. I was thin. I could barely stand up through the whole ceremony. It was the most honest day of my life. The legal side of everything moved faster than I expected. Daniel and my father had been quietly, carefully, methodically building a case for months. Financial records, testimony from women John had targeted who were willing to speak, bank transfers that documented the flow of money through the network, and something Daniel had held quietly, carefully, because he'd understood its weight: recordings. Audio recordings from years ago, from the period when he'd still been adjacent to the operation, that documented conversations, arrangements, the explicit articulation of what the network was doing and why. He had carried those recordings like a weight he was waiting for the right moment to put down. That moment was now. The morning the police arrested John, I was sitting up in my hospital bed with a cup of tea my mother had brought from home, and my father texted me a single line. "It's done." I set the tea down. I looked out the window. I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I'd expected. I felt something quieter, something closer to the sensation of a headache that had been so constant you'd stopped noticing it suddenly, finally lifting. John was taken in handcuffs from the university campus where he'd apparently continued to operate, apparently confident he was untouchable. There is a particular kind of arrogance, I've learned, that comes from having gotten away with things for a long time. It makes people careless. It made John careless. Mr. Hargrove was arrested hours later at his home office. I thought about Daniel when I heard that, about what it must have cost him to do what he'd done, to take everything he had on his own father and hand it to the people who would use it to destroy him. I thought about the years he'd spent knowing what his father was, carrying that, trying to figure out what his own culpability was and what it obligated him to do. That's not a simple thing. That's not a thing that gets resolved cleanly. When I asked him about it later, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I used to think that leaving was enough, that walking away from something wrong was the same as doing something right. It's not. Those are different things. Do you regret it?" I said, turning him in. "No," he said, "I just wish I'd done it sooner, before more people got hurt." He meant me. He didn't say that, but he meant me. I held his hand. The investigation took on a life of its own once it began. Journalists found angles we hadn't anticipated. Former students came forward. The university's board was restructured. Several people who had believed themselves completely protected discovered that protection has limits when the evidence is voluminous and well documented. I watched a lot of it from my hospital room, and then from the room at my parents' house where I recovered for several months after my final treatment, and then from our apartment, mine and Daniel's. The one we found together, with furniture we chose together, with nothing in it that felt like a cover story. The doctor's words in that exam room the morning I walked out: "Your recovery is incredible. Honestly, it's almost a miracle." I kept coming back to those words. Almost a miracle. But here's what I've come to understand about that, about the concept of miraculous survival and what makes it actually mean something. It wasn't the cancer. Surviving the cancer, as terrifying and brutal as it was in some ways the straightforward part. It happened to my body, and my body endured it, and medical science helped it endure, and I was fortunate. Desperately, gratefully fortunate. What was harder was surviving the version of myself who had been so hungry for something to feel real that she'd mistaken a performance for a person. The version of myself who had looked at a man who truly loved her and said no because the love wasn't loud enough, wasn't cinematic enough, didn't arrive with enough electricity. The version of myself who had confused being seen by someone for actually being known. That girl had some very hard lessons to sit with, and here's what I've concluded about her after everything: she wasn't stupid. She was young, and she'd been raised in a world where the performances were polished and the arrangements were careful, and she was starving for something that felt unmediated and genuine. John had found that hunger and fed it something that looked exactly like what she needed. That's not stupidity. That's a level of calculated predation that her 20-year-old self wasn't equipped to recognize. She forgives herself for not recognizing it. It took a while to get there, but she does. I am 21 now. There are days when I look in the mirror and what I see is still mostly the aftermath. The physical evidence of what my body went through is still there. It will always be there in some form, changed and changed again. I am not the girl who walked out of her parents' house with a bag and a certainty that she knew exactly what she needed. I am something better than that girl, even if I am also something more broken. Daniel makes coffee every morning before I wake up. This is not a romantic gesture that he makes for an audience. There is no audience. It is just something he does because he noticed that I function better if there is coffee already made when I come downstairs. That is the whole story of why he does it. He noticed something about me and he adjusted his behavior to serve it. I have noticed things about him too. The way he carries the weight of his father's actions, not publicly, not in any way you'd see unless you knew where to look, but in the way he is sometimes very careful about the impact of small things, as if he's still recalibrating the scale of what a person can cause. The way he checks in, without making it a check-in, in ways that give me the chance to answer honestly. The way he says what he means, consistently and without decoration, and has never once said something to me that I later discovered was architecture rather than truth. We don't talk about John very much. There's not much left to say. He is in a legal process that will take years to fully resolve. His father's network has been largely dismantled. There will be trials and settlements and more revelations, and none of it will give back to any of those women the time they lost or the damage they absorbed. I testified. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, and I've done some objectively hard things. But I sat in that room and I said what had happened as clearly and completely as I could, and when it was over I sat in a car in a parking garage for about 20 minutes and then I called Daniel and he came. He always comes. I've been thinking about what to take away from all of this because I think there has to be something beyond just survival, beyond just the raw fact of having gotten through it. Some kind of understanding that was worth the price of its acquisition, even if the price was absurd. Here is what I have, imperfect and incomplete. The people who love you are often quiet about it. Not because it means less to them, but because it has nowhere to go, it has no performance to give, no audience to impress. It just shows up again and again in the unspectacular and essential moments that don't photograph well and don't make good stories, and are entirely the substance of an actual life. The people who want something from you are often very loud about love. They have to be. The loudness is doing the work that the love isn't. I mistook loudness for depth and quietness for absence, and it cost me years and almost cost me everything. I don't think I'm the only person who has ever made that mistake. I'm not sharing this because I want your sympathy. I have enough of my own and I'm still learning what to do with it. I'm sharing it because I spent a long time thinking that the version of me who walked out of that house was brave, and the version of me who ended up back in it was a failure. And I've come to understand that's backward. The version of me who walked back in, who let herself be found, who let herself be loved by someone whose love didn't need to be loud, who sat in a hospital chapel in a thin dress with no hair and said yes, that version was the brave one. Brave looks like a lot of different things. Sometimes it looks like walking away, and sometimes it looks like staying. Sometimes it looks like finally saying yes to the person who has already proven in every way that actually matters that they mean it. If you made it this far, thank you. I know this is long. I know it's a lot. I don't know why I decided to put it here of all places, some combination of anonymity and distance and the fact that it's past midnight and the apartment is quiet and Daniel is asleep, and I felt the need to put it somewhere outside of myself. He doesn't know I'm writing this. He would probably just make that small, half-smile face he makes when I do things that don't require his input and go back to sleep. The cancer is in remission. The men who hurt me are in the process of facing consequences. My mother texted me a picture of the garden this morning and it looked exactly like I remembered it. I am 21 years old. And somehow, improbably, with a lot of help from people who loved me more carefully than I'd been willing to see, I'm still here. That's the whole story. Or at least the part I know how to tell.